Welcome to Unit 5, Gender Responsive Language Use. By the end of this unit, you should be able to describe how gender bias manifests in beliefs, attitudes, language, and behaviors. Use appropriate gender-responsive language in classroom interaction. Know how to provide constructive feedback for all your students. Language is one of the most powerful tools to define and reinforce gender relations and can be used to promote inclusion and gender awareness or to reinforce gender bias and stereotypes. The language that teachers use provides an important model for students and the larger community. Teachers, like all human beings, are susceptible to having gender bias based on their socialization, education, and experiences. Their language, both verbal and nonverbal, can reflect unconscious assumptions about gender roles. In verbal communication, for example, teachers might discourage girls from taking science by telling them that such subjects are for boys or are too difficult for girls. If a boy student cries or expresses vulnerable emotions, a teacher might tell him to stop acting like a girl. Nonverbal communication might be rolling one's eyes, raising eyebrows, or smirking at a response or question that a girl might share, which can communicate indifference or judgment on the part of the teacher. Other gestures and body language, such as winking, touching, brushing, grabbing, or other physical moves, may be covertly or overtly sexual and create a lack of safety for students. It is important for teachers to examine their language used to eliminate choices that silence, stereotype, or constrain others. Teachers can also ask critical questions and provide new frameworks that challenge existing cultural norms. But to do so, it is important to first understand the bias each of us carries, cautiously or unconsciously. What do you think implicit bias is? Can you provide one or two examples of implicit bias? Everyone has implicit bias to some extent. Implicit bias refers to the underlying beliefs, attitudes, or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner. They are implicit because we are not aware that we have them. It shapes how we see the world and how we see other people. Take a moment to read this slide silently. While we can see that the word the is written twice, our brains are able to make shortcuts to make meaning out of the sentence. Our brains make shortcuts like this every day. We receive 11 million bits of sensory information every moment. We can only consciously process around 40 of them. So, our brains make shortcuts. We form ideas, assumptions, and associations about groups of people over the course of a lifetime through exposure to messages we receive from our families, communities, culture, schools, religions, governments, and media. They are often in a form of stereotypes that often represent groups in very limited and discriminatory ways. Implicit bias is not anyone's fault, but it is our responsibility to change it. I'd like to share a riddle called The Surgeon's Dilemma. A father and son are in a horrible car accident. The father dies. The son is rushed to the emergency room. Just as he's about to go under the knife, the surgeon says, "I can't operate on this boy. He is my son." How might you explain this? The answer is that the surgeon is the boy's mother. If you did not come up with the answer, you are not alone. The researchers ran the riddle by two groups, 197 university psychology students and 103 children ages 7 to 17 in the US. Only 15% of the children and 14% of the university students came up with the "mom is the surgeon" answer. Gender biases are pervasive and can be deeply entrenched. It requires deliberate effort to transform them. Gender bias is a preference or belief that one gender is superior to another. It results in unequal expectations, attitudes, language use, and treatment. Bias can be cautious or unconscious and may manifest in many ways, both subtle and obvious. Gender bias is something we all have due to our social conditioning. It is important to become more self-aware so that we can work on unlearning and overcoming our biases. Let's watch this short video on how gender bias might show up in the classroom, why it matters, and what you as a teacher can do about it.
Gender inequality is a profound injustice. It keeps millions of women around the world in poverty. Women are one half of the world's population, yet we are often denied equal access to health, education, and political and economic participation. It's first and foremost a rights issue, but gender inequality also significantly damages a country's economic development.
What's that got to do with me? I'm just a teacher, not a politician.
Teachers have enormous power to promote gender equity by modeling positive behavior in the classroom. Teachers often lose sight of the fact that if they have 40 students working in the classroom, they're working with 40 individuals. And each of those 40 is unique and special, with their own talents and with their own learning needs, and with the potential to be successful and happy if permitted and helped to be so. However, instead of seeing diverse individuals, many teachers simply see 20 males and 20 females. And when teachers think of children only in terms of their gender, they start to make all sorts of assumptions about them, about what they like, what they're good at, and even what they should end up doing when they leave school.
I can promise you that neither me nor any of my colleagues ever go into a classroom intending to discriminate. So how does it happen? Maybe gender bias can be so deeply rooted within us that we don't even recognize it.
She's right, you know. Come with me and let's see some of the ways in which teachers may unintentionally promote gender bias. Listen, teachers often assign tasks along gender lines.
I need 4 strong boys to move the desks. Girls, sweep up the floor when the desks have been moved.
Teachers also often ask questions in a way that makes an unnecessary distinction between the sexes.
What do the boys think? And what do the girls think?
Why would you expect all the boys to have one answer and all the girls to have a different answer because of their gender? We are your students. You know us. We are individuals. Research shows that boys generally receive more questions than girls.
Who can answer that one? Marco.
Teachers often encourage students to believe that certain emotions are unacceptable for one gender.
Stop that loud laughter. It's not ladylike.
Okay. Okay, we get it.
We get it.
Now, how about giving us some advice to help us change our behavior?
Encourage both genders to recognize that their adult lives will probably include work, parenting, and housework. Make sure your expectations are the same for all your students. Both boys and girls can succeed at math, science, language, art, and sport. Actively integrate groups of students by making sure boys and girls sit together in mixed groups. Remember, when you ask a question, boys are more likely to call out or raise their hands to volunteer answers. Girls tend to spend a few seconds thinking quietly to themselves. So after you ask a question, allow 3 to 5 seconds before calling on a student to answer. This means both boys and girls will be ready to answer. Being aware of our own gender bias and amending our behavior isn't easy. It needs us to embark on a process of reflection and change. Why not try working through our gender bias checklist? Reflecting on its questions, you'll find it helpful. Never forget how much children learn from your example. By modeling gender equity, teachers can change the future of society into one that is fairer, more fulfilling, and more prosperous. Isn't that what we all want? What do you say, teachers?
We can do it!
You'll find plenty of lessons on gender in the Aflatun training manual. We hope you enjoy them.
In order to increase your gender bias awareness, take the next 15 minutes to do a self-assessment. Please download the form and review the following list to identify ways that you may intentionally or unintentionally communicate gender bias. Read each statement and check the box that reflects your behavior. Please be as honest as possible because this will allow you to gain greater awareness. Then count the number of checks in each column and put the total at the bottom. If you have checked frequently or sometimes for any of the statements, you may be demonstrating gender bias in the classroom, and these are areas you should work on. Take a moment to reflect on your experience and results. Were you surprised by the results of your self-assessment? Why or why not? What concrete steps can you take to limit your gender bias in the classroom? It is very important that teachers become aware of any gender biased beliefs, attitudes, or stereotypes they may have learned and work to overcome them. They can accomplish this through self-reflection, training, reading, peer support, exposing themselves to examples and stories that defy gender assumptions, and implementing national and school policies on gender equality. As you gain greater awareness of your own biases, it might be helpful to retake this self-assessment after a semester or a year to see if you have made progress. Review the following gender-biased language and rewrite the sentence using gender-responsive language practices. Here are some tips for using gender-responsive language. Use all relevant pronouns. For example, instead of saying, a student will be successful if he works hard, you could say, a student will be successful if he or she works hard. Use the plural instead of the singular. For example, students will be successful if they work hard. Recast a sentence in the passive voice. For example, hard work will lead to success. Recast the sentence to avoid using the definite pronoun. For example, students who work hard will be successful. Create gender balance or neutrality in labels or titles. For example, instead of saying chairman, say chairperson. The classroom is an ideal place to raise learners' awareness of how gender stereotypes are perpetuated through language use so that they can be active participants in creating a more inclusive culture in the classroom and community. Gender stereotypes and roles are socially constructed and passed on through the language we use and the messages we receive from sources such as media, culture, and books, to name just a few. Try the following activity to deconstruct common African proverbs. Proverbs are short statements often used in African culture and around the world to illustrate ideas and deliver messages of inspiration, consolation, celebration, and advice. Proverbs used without critical lens of gender can reinforce negative beliefs about gender. Please take a moment to analyze the proverbs displayed in the slide by checking the appropriate boxes. Once you have analyzed them, see if you can rewrite the proverb or come up with a new one that promotes gender equality. Constructive feedback looks at what can be improved rather than focusing on what is wrong. The language a teacher uses can guide a student in the direction they need to go and help them to feel that the teacher cares about their learning and inspire them to become more engaged and involved in the classroom. Constructive feedback is a two-way process involving the teacher and the learner. Teachers should strive to create an environment where they can both give and receive feedback with students in a positive and generative way to ensure that learning is taking place. Teachers need to make a deliberate effort to provide and encourage feedback with all students by establishing rapport and communicating in a way that is respectful and appropriate. Here are 4 basic tips for providing effective feedback. Specifically, affirm what they did well. Correct and direct. It is important to correct their mistakes without shaming them and direct them to the right answer. You might provide the correct answer, ask strategic questions, or guide them to find the answer on their own. Point out the process. Guide your students to identify what steps they need to take to get a better result. Coach students to reflect on their own efforts. Strategic questions can support students to evaluate and guide their own learning process. It helps them to take ownership of their work and know how to improve it. Additional resources. Up next is Unit 6, Gender Responsive Lesson Planning.